presentation on an important aspect for debt management that are worth supporting through technical assistance. Earlier, Chidi presented to us the good news for today's session, namely, the African Development Bank has been able to mobilize resources to provide technical assistance to debt management offices in transition states in order to strengthen their capabilities and make their very important role more effective. So what I would like to add to Chidi's presentation is a number of areas that are worth supporting for TA. On this, I want to leverage on my own experience delivering technical assistance on debt management practices, policies, operations, all throughout the world, and a modest experience that I have had in Africa, in African countries, over the last 7 years or so. My presentation, I will focus on an introduction and a motivation, then a brief description of major salient features of public debt, sustainability, and management in transition states. Next, I want to reflect on a few important lessons that experience delivering technical assistance with the African Development Bank as well as with other development partners can be useful to think of this process of technical assistance that we can have going forward, supported by the project that Chidi described to us. Finally, I would like to present a few avenues for fruitful technical assistance that, in my humble opinion, are worth considering for this project and for all of you participants when requesting support. So, I am a macroeconomist in my original career. So I'm coming from Argentina. So, as you probably know, my country has been going through debt problems, debt crisis for a long while. And any good macroeconomist in Argentina always look at sustainability problems as the starting point to reflect on why debt is so high, why the quality of debt is not adequate, why the sources of financing or the financing terms may not be appropriate. So let me take this bias in my own professional career and invite you to look at debt management from the perspective of public debt sustainability. As it was mentioned earlier in this conference, there are serious problems of debt sustainability in transition states. In particular, if we look at the most commonly used framework to assess debt sustainability in low-income countries that was put together by the World Bank and the IMF many years ago and has been evolving since, we may see that among 54 African countries, low-income countries, there are 38 countries that recently were assessed either to be in debt distress or to be at high risk of experiencing debt distress or being at moderate risk of experiencing debt distress. Within these 38 African low-income countries, 23 are transition states. So the point I want to make is that transition states are either experiencing difficulties to service the government's financial obligations, this is what we refer to as being in debt distress, or they are assessed to be highly likely to experience debt servicing difficulties in the medium to long term. This is what we mean by high risk of debt distress. And even those that do not have a high probability, given the current outlook for public finances and economic performance. They may be exposed to shocks, like, for instance, unexpected currency depreciations, increases in global interest rates, collapses in their export prices. And these vulnerabilities may lead to a debt distress situation. This is what we refer as moderate risk of debt distress. So, debt sustainability problems are a risk or a reality. In the 23 transition states, you have in the slide identify who of them are in debt distress. These are Sao Tome and Principe, Somalia, Sudan, and Zimbabwe, who are at high risk of debt distress, namely Burundi, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Comoros, Djibouti, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and South Sudan. And finally, at moderate risk of debt distress, we find Burkina Faso, Congo DR, Guinea, Liberia, Madagascar, Mali, Niger, and Togo. Now, as GD was emphasizing, public debt management can potentially assist to mitigate sustainability risk. This is for the countries that had a moderate or high risk of debt distress. Or it can help countries restore debt sustainability. This for those transition states that are already experiencing debt service difficulties. And the good news is that the African Development Institute stands ready to assist debt managers in their key functions. In the slide, we have essentially a summary of the project that GD described for us before my presentation. So now, why do we have these debt sustainability problems? And what can be done about them going forward? Now, it's important to start thinking that a country has debt sustainability problems because it has too much debt. And then we have to define what we mean by having too much debt. How much public debt is too much debt? Well, we measure the debt burden looking at the size of the financial obligations that a government is liable for in the short term, that could be the debt service, or in the long term, that could be the total debt stock. And we relate that measure of financial obligations to a measure of repayment capacity, to a measure of access the government can have to resources that can potentially be used to service the existing debt as well as future debt that will be incurred in upcoming years. So when we consider the debt burden of the transition states by looking at the debt to GDP ratios, we can find that first, on average, transition states carry a heavy public debt burden. It's equivalent to around 60% of GDP by 2023. And this heavy debt burden has been growing even before the pandemic. Between 2019 and 2023, for instance, the average public debt ratio increased by nearly 10 percentage points across the transition states. And what is also interesting is that, sorry. And what is interesting is that while countries that have a moderate risk of debt distress have debt ratios closer to the group average, there is a variety of debt burdens for countries that have a high risk of debt distress. And the same for countries that are in debt distress. So you see a lot of volatility in the levels of the debt when we move to high risk or in debt distress transition states. And this is very telling because it indicates that by itself, the size of debt does not determine whether the country has debt sustainability problems or not. A country can have debt sustainability problems if debt is high. That is intuitive. But the country can have debt sustainability problems even when the debt level is moderate. So it's very important to consider the size of debt, yes, but one has to go much more deeper than that. Then let's look at the composition of the public debt. In particular, let's focus on the external public debt, which is still the bulk of the source of funding for transition states. We will observe that by and large, external debt is provided from multilateral and bilateral funding sources. This is observed all across the country group. But there has been a growing importance in recent years of non-traditional creditors, typically China, Arabs, and the Arab countries. And what's interesting, when one starts looking at the situation of the individual countries, is to notice that countries at moderate risk of debt distress tend to have relatively more multilateral debt. Whereas countries with high risk of debt distress or in debt distress, they tend to have much more bilateral debt, particularly for non-traditional creditors, and financial liabilities with the private sector, like commercial banks, international commercial banks. So the sources of funding seem to have an impact on the debt sustainability. And here is when debt management kicks in first. Transition states tend to be what I call debt takers, taking the, and not debt makers. Transition states tend to have the option to accept or decline a capital project that comes with a loan, but they have few or no degrees of freedoms in order to negotiate the terms of the financing. For instance, the International Donor Association lends to low-income countries under very standard financing terms that cannot be negotiated by individual borrowers. And the same you could also say about the China Exim Bank. And the same you can think about many major financiers of transition states. They basically run the financing terms. And the transition state remains with the freedom of accepting or declining the project and the associated loan. But this means that it's very important for debt management to start selecting the loans and the projects in the first place, because there is having an active policy to accept or reject the loans, because that's the only leeway that is given. The financing terms are still hard to negotiate. Going further into the financing terms of the external debt, one can look at how much is the concessional debt carried by transition states. And one wonder how much public debt appears inexpensive because it is concessional. Now, although all the transition states do have access to concessional debt, we observe that concessional debts remains significant for countries that have a moderate risk of debt distress. Whereas those with high risk of debt distress or in debt distress, except a few cases, they tend to have lower concessional debt. And this relates to the fact that they have been borrowing more from bilaterals and from the private sector, whose degree of concessionality, measured, for instance, by the grant element, is much lower. Now, we have discussed the size, the composition, and the expensiveness of public debt in transition economies. But these are pictures. It's not static pictures. It's not a dynamic movie. And we know that when we discuss sustainability and what debt management can do to improve sustainability conditions, we need to have a forward-looking assessment. A debt is sustainable and a debtor is solvent when in upcoming years the debtor is expected to generate resources to service the outstanding debt and the future debt that could be taken. So it's not so much how much is the debt level today, but the prospects for the accumulation of debt in the future, as well as the capacity to generate resources to repay the debt that matters. So let's now take a different stance and let's look into the future. And let's focus first in the relationship between debt sustainability, the debt burden, and the growth prospects. Now, we all know that economic growth is the first key element that supports sustainability. And we know that transition states need public debt financing to support economic growth. However, for the short-term growth prospects that are prepared by the IMF and published in the World Economic Outlook, the bad news is that for most transition states, the projected GDP growth will be insufficient to stabilize the debt to GDP ratios in the short term. Oh, I have to apologize. I need to run simultaneously two presentations. Here we go. So in the presentation, in the slide, we have ordered the transition states in two dimensions: the public debt burden, measured by the debt ratio, and the GDP growth projected for the year 2024. And we have split these two dimensions into 4 quadrants. As you can see, in the red quadrant, we have a concentration of transition states in the area characterized by a heavy debt burden and a relatively low growth performance. So this is certainly a concern because it's difficult to grow out of debt when the growth performance is insufficient to at least stabilize the debt to GDP ratio. Now, not only the future growth performance should help the transition states generate revenues or other budget resources that can be used to service debt, we have to also be mindful that in the future, the governments will continue borrowing. Not only they have to repay the outstanding debt as of today, but also the future debt that will be necessary. And for that, we can look at the situation concerning future budget deficits. As you know well, budget deficits are a major reason why governments borrow. Within the budget deficit, there is, for instance, the capital budget, and many of the financing secured by the government is earmarked to finance capital projects. More advanced economies finance operating expenses using debt. So all the excess spending over revenues is captured by the fiscal deficit. And the fiscal deficit is a major reason that for governments, as I said, to secure financing and borrow. Now, if we look at the transition states and we identify the public debt burden and the current fiscal imbalances, we find again that the situation is very worrisome. We split the debt burden and the fiscal balance in two segments, and we obtain again 4 quadrants. And unfortunately, we continue having a concentration on transition states in the red quadrant, in which we have an unfortunate combination of high public debt burdens and high fiscal deficits. So in this context, what can we say about debt management? Well, we mentioned earlier that, I want to suggest that a poorly managed debt is more likely to become unsustainable. So it's very important to see how governments are managing debt, particularly when we have so many cases within transition states of countries experiencing debt distress or being at high risk of facing difficulties to service debt. Now, there is a well-known tool developed by the World Bank that's called the Debt Management Performance Assessment, or DEMPA. And the DEMPA produces diagnostics of the major characteristics of institutions, practices, and operations concerning debt management. There are 16 areas that are diagnosed by the DEMPA, just as a doctor looks at the blood pressure or the cholesterol or the level of sugar in the blood when a patient goes to have a medical checkup. So there are different dimensions. The dimensions are presented in the slide. They run from the legal framework, the managerial structure of the DMO, whether there is a debt management strategy, the debt reporting and evaluation, the audit. And let me go to the other side. They have the debt reporting, the debt and debt-related records, the segregation of duties, by which we mean the assignment of responsibilities for the negotiation of the debt, the contracting of the debt, the settlement, the repayment of the debt, the recording, etc. Now, on these dimensions, the African countries, which include a few transition states, not all of them, African countries underperform other countries for which the DEMPA results are available. So there is room to improve debt management practices along the several dimensions that we can see in the DEMPA, and I will organize in my presentation in a few slides. Now, the good news for transition states is that there is a more nuanced picture concerning debt management capabilities that results from a different study conducted by the World Bank, which is called the Debt Transparency Report. In this report that has a broader coverage of countries, we can identify that across the transition states, there are some areas in which the capacity is strong. In particular, the access to debt data, the instrument coverage of debt data statistics, and the periodicity of debt reports. So, there are also other areas, unfortunately, in which the transition states do not perform well, and these are areas for potential technical assistance. These include the sectorial coverage of the debt, the availability of a debt management strategy, the formulation and implementation of annual borrowing plans, and the degree of information released concerning the details like financing terms or debt service obligation in the short term that is reported by the transition states to the World Bank. Now, interesting, we can have some transition states that perform extremely well and stand out within the group. Like, for instance, Burkina Faso, which happens to be the first one. But we also have Liberia. On the other extreme, there are others that have serious deficiencies in all these aspects of debt management. So now, if these are areas for debt management, what are the lessons learned from previous technical assistance experiences that can be taken on board? Let me just mention 4 areas, given the scarcity of time, that repeatedly stand out as places where technical assistance and support is worth receiving. These are, on debt transparency, the existence of hidden debts, under-recording and under-reporting. Now, to manage debt, the Debt Management Office, the Ministry of Finance, and the government overall needs to know how much debt is to be serviced. And the issue of debt transparency has to do a lot with that. The debt transparency is not also important for development partners or for investors. It's important for the government itself when resources have to be generated in order to service the debt. There are serious deficiencies, sometimes in recording the debt. I have gone through many countries in which there is a serious problem in the Debt Management Office that consists in that the staff is not properly trained in transforming the provisions in the loan contract into the fields of the DEMFAS or the Meridian debt management recording system. This may lead to under-recording. Next, there are problems of in countries not generating sufficiently sound debt reports. That is, not only the information should be in the debt recording system, it has to be made public through an official report. This is an area in which a lot of work is always needed. The second area is the authorization of debt, of direct debt and guarantees. In some countries, the legal framework is not clear enough concerning the role of the Ministry of Finance, and in particular the Debt Management Office, in the process of debt negotiation, approval of the loan contracts, and settlement of debts. So it's very important to establish responsibilities and to endow the Ministry of Finance with vetting power at some point in the process of government borrowing. As I mentioned earlier, many transition states still rely heavily on project finance. And the project finance is oftentimes negotiated outside the Ministry of Finance. It's negotiated by the line ministries. And if the legal framework and the institutional practices are not clear enough, the Ministry of Finance may come to know very late in the process what's the loan about, what are the financing terms, what will be the future resources necessary to service the debt. So it's very important to have clarity in the legal framework on these authorizations to participate in each stage of the debt cycle: negotiation, loan contracting, settlement, repayment, etc. A third area that pops up as deficient easily is the management of contingent liabilities. There is a variety of financial obligations that come to the desk of the Ministry of Finance unexpectedly, not properly assessed, and with not properly quantified. We include in these contingent liabilities the guarantees. Sometimes the legislation is not clear on the role of the Ministry of Finance being the last authority to approve the guarantees. But also it expands to public-private partnerships or implicit guarantees when governments have to, for instance, support the operation, the debt service obligations of loss-making state-owned enterprises. This is a growing area, and a lot of technical assistance is needed here. Finally, the fourth point I want to emphasize are the staffing issues in the Debt Management Office. The Debt Management Office is probably one of the most important units in the Ministry of Finance, given its role in managing debt, and yet it's oftentimes understaffed with high rotation, with poorly paid civil servants, and in some cases even with contractors, not even with permanent staff. And this creates a lot of problems, because the debt is a politically very sensitive issue, and yet the staff that manages the debt in the Ministry of Finance is usually not well equipped technically in terms of IT and with the proper compensation. So in the interest of time, let me fast forward. To a few ideas on how to move forward. First, a friend of mine always make the analogy between a plane that needs to run safely and a safe debt management. And he asked what makes a plane run safely, and one can identify several elements that ensures a safe flight. That includes the working of the engine and the turbines that generates the motion of the plane, but also the flight plan and the course steered and the GPS, that is the direction that the plane was to take. Now, a plane needs to accelerate thanks to the engine and the turbines, but it also needs some brakes. And in particular, the passengers need the seat belts. So there should be a risk management of flying too fast or going through a course different from the one steered according to the flight plan. And also, the planes need to have a solid steel frame in which everything is mounted. Now, this idea of the engine, the flight plan, and the steel frame is very similar to the roles that in the Debt Management Office we assign to the front office that generates the debt, the middle office that sets the debt strategy and establishes the risk management framework, and the overall DMO, including the back office that is responsible for the operational framework. Now, as for debt generation, it relates to the volume of borrowing, the composition and the timing. And here, as we all know well, the debt is created typically because there is a project to be funded or there is a deficit to be financed. So debt management cannot do much to contribute to debt sustainability by stopping the borrowing process, because the borrowing process is a result out of other aspects of policy decision making, including fiscal policy, investment policy, etc. So I then think that the other two components, the debt strategy and the risk management, pertaining to the middle office and the back office, are particularly important for transition states. Remember, transition states do not negotiate loans. The role of the front office is very limited, but the role of the middle office and the back office is very prominent. As for the middle office, it's important that transition state formulate debt and risk management strategies and develop the domestic financial markets, the domestic debt markets, I mean. Technical assistance is very important in this area, and as you remember, these are elements that pop up full of reds and oranges in the analysis of debt transparency. As for the operational framework, in which I should say the back office has a major role, it's very important to set up the institutional framework, and it has to do with formulating and enacting adequate legislation that identifies mandates and responsibilities for the different stages of the debt cycle and entitles the Ministry of Finance and the Debt Management Office with proper responsibilities and resources. Next, the debt reporting and the debt recording are very important. As I said, the debt cannot be managed if there is no accurate measurement of the financial liabilities, if there is no accurate registry of the financing terms, the interest rates, the maturities, the creditors. Now, related to analytical tasks that admittedly are the realm of the middle office, it's very important to formulate debt strategies and annual borrowing plans in order to give predictability to the borrowing activity. And finally, it's very important to train the debt management staff. I'm afraid these were the slides, okay, that I was referring to. So let me pause here and conclude by saying that the different elements that I mentioned, particularly in the last 3 slides, inspired the sessions that we will have together today and tomorrow. In particular, Honorable Terkper will talk about the governance and the debt strategy and the strategy for debt management. The technical session number 4 will focus on the structure of the DMO and will be delivered by Dr. Nagwankuo. The technical session number 5 touches upon the institutional aspects, will be led by Ms. Kiersey, and will discuss the loan negotiations and the debt restructuring. The technical session number 6 relates to issues in the Debt Management Office concerning the coordination of the borrowing activity and the linkages between debt and cash management. It will be delivered by Mr. Kinyaun. And finally, the technical session number 7, to be delivered by Honorable Busaid, will look at innovative debt instruments. So I very much look forward to a first exploration of these many topics in the roundtable after the break, and then the successive sessions that we will share today and tomorrow. Thank you.